or three people have done it, and you seem to be kind of somewhere in the middle. Please don't be ashamed. Please do share where you want to be, where you think you are. I'll give you another 15 seconds just to check that you can find it. Thank you to the three people who've added to this. By the way, there's two different lines, so you've got the top arrow and the bottom arrow. You might have different answers to them. You might be that at one end, the top one you might be on the right hand side, and the bottom one you might be on the left hand side. Okay, so most people seem to be somewhere in the middle, but tipping a little bit towards the right hand side for them. Okay. So what I'm hoping to show you in this presentation is a little bit the pros and cons of using materials as they are, adapting everything. And there's not one correct answer to this. And also pros and cons of being routine and using similar activities, and then introducing new activities all the time. Okay, so let me just clear that annotation. Okay, so I would like you to think about an upcoming lesson that you have. It could be an online lesson, it could be a face-to-face lesson. I'd like you to have a specific lesson in mind while we go through the rest of the slides. That will help you if you've got, maybe you can imagine the exact materials that you're using, imagine the students, and think about what they actually need from the lesson. Okay, once you have a specific lesson in mind, a specific group in mind, can you give me a thumbs up on Zoom? Thanks, everyone. It might be the lesson, the next lesson that you're teaching. It might be one next week. Okay, Danielle. I'll wait for a thumbs up from about 2/3 of you before I continue. So, yeah, Danielle. The thumbs up, by the way, is okay in the chat if that's easier. I've got 3 out of 9 at the moment, I think. 3 out of 8. 1 or 2 more? Ooh, so this is the challenge with getting your students to interact. Right now, I can't see any of you. I have no feedback at all, apart from what you choose to write, what you choose to share. You are welcome to put your videos on if you want to, you don't have to. I think we've all experienced this kind of wall of names. Thank you, Tanya. Very briefly. It just gives you a little bit of feedback from the participants in your session. Okay, so you have your upcoming lesson in mind, and then you need to adapt your materials. Before you start adapting your materials, it's important that you have a few pieces of information in mind. So you need to think about your course objectives as a whole. Where are your students heading for at the end of the year, at the end of the course? You need to think about what do your learners actually need and want from their lessons, or from you as a teacher. You might do some learner analysis, needs analysis, sorry. You might do learner questionnaires, but find out more about what they need or what they want. One of the easiest ways to do this, and something that I very often do in a first lesson, is I write a short letter to my students. So I tell them, you know, my name's Sandy, I'm going to be your teacher this year. I like learning languages because This is how I practice languages, blah, 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 blah. I'm practicing Polish at the moment. I lived in Poland for the last 6 years. I'm practicing Polish at the moment. This is how I do it, blah, blah, blah. Tell me about you. How do you learn English? Why do you want to have English classes? What are you interested in? And this kind of letter is a great kind of starting point for finding out what your students are interested in, and therefore helping you to adapt your materials a little bit. Another thing to do is deciding on the lesson objectives. If you don't know the exact objectives of that lesson, then there's no point trying to adapt the materials because you're just doing it blindly. So you need to be sure about where it is that you're aiming for in that particular lesson. So I asked you to think about a specific lesson that you're teaching. What is the objective of your lesson? You don't have to write this, you can think about it. So we always started our objectives like this at our school. By the end of the lesson, students will be better able to, so by the end of the lesson, students will be better able to write a letter of complaint. By the end of the lesson, students will be better able to tell a story about what they did last weekend. So what is your lesson objective? Sophia, don't worry, thank you. I understand that not everybody has strong connections. It's just nice to see 1 or 2 people and get a bit of feedback. Once you've got your lesson objectives, what you might want to do to adapt your materials is something which is called backwards planning. So backwards planning means that you start with what you want to achieve, for example, telling a story about the weekend, and then you work backwards and think about what are the stages you need to be able to achieve this? What do the students need to be able to tell a story about their weekend? Okay, so it might be that they need some preparation time to think about what happened at the weekend. It might be that they need some language to talk about specific typical weekend activities. For example, going to the cinema, meeting your friends, going to the beach, whatever. So you're going to feed in some phrases. It might be that they need some functional language. They might need phrases like, you'll never guess what happened last weekend, or I was at the park, and what do you think happened next? So some functional language phrases that you might want to feed in. And then you think, okay, you're going backwards from the end. So how are you actually going to introduce the topic? How are you going to get them interested in it? Maybe you're going to walk into the lesson, and the very first thing you're going to do, the very first thing you're going to say when you switch on your camera, when you start the lesson, is, I saw a crocodile yesterday. And then what are the students going to do? See how they react, what happens. So I've started at the end and I've worked backwards. You can do this with anything that you want to achieve. So that's the idea of backwards planning. Okay, so in the abstract, I promised you a little bit of theory. This theory is designed to give you frameworks for thinking about adapting your materials. So I can't give you answers about how to adapt every set of materials for every lesson, but by giving you a framework, I can give you a way to think about the materials in your lessons. So we've already got the idea of starting from your course objectives, what the learners want, and the lesson objectives. What do you do next? So I'm just going to share the screen again. Or how do you think about it next? Okay, so if you start off from the question of why are you adapting materials, you have different ways that you can think about materials adaptation. So this is from some work, this is from a book by Cunningsworth that's called Choosing Your Coursebook. And he said that these are possible reasons for adapting your materials. Firstly, he said it's important to do this because every learning and teaching situation is unique and it depends on a variety of factors. These include, for example, learner motivation, learner expectations. What do they think they're going to get from your lessons? Availability of resources. So has every student got a course book, or are you just sharing materials and they have notebooks? When you're teaching online, are they working on phones? Are they working on tablets? Are they working on computers? Have they got a strong enough internet connection to be able to put a camera on? Or is it audio only? Or is it so weak that it's only text that they can't deal with the audio? What are your syllabus constraints? So for example, in my school, we had one course book, 1 year. So it was one double page spread per lesson. And if you didn't keep up with that pace, then the students probably wouldn't finish the book. So you had to make adaptation decisions every lesson because it wasn't possible to do every activity in the book. Classroom dynamics, how do your groups work together? You know, if it's just one-to-one, then you will be adapting it very differently to if you have a group of 40 people. So how does the class work? How do the groups work? And how well do they get on with each other? It might be that you've got 40 people who hate each other and never want to speak to each other. So you have to consider that. And then personalities involved as well. Have you got more extroverted, more dominant students? Have you got quieter students? Have you got students who prefer to do things more analytically, more creatively? All of those factors will influence how you choose to adapt your materials. And Cunningsworth said then that material can nearly always be improved by being adapted to suit the particular situation where it's being used. So I asked you earlier on whether you never adapt, always adapt, and a lot of you, those of you who added to it, said that you tend to be somewhere in the middle. So this is the idea that generally adaptation is useful, but adaptation doesn't have to involve lots of work. That's what I'm going to show you by the end of this. Adaptation doesn't mean creating a whole new lesson from scratch. Okay, so we have this idea of why adapt materials. As I mentioned at the beginning, all of these slides will be available. I'll put the link in to the chat at the end as well. Okay, McGrath, who's another writer about materials, he suggests that when you look at your materials, you might have 4 processes that you go through. But in order to go through these processes, you have to be very clear about your lesson objectives. So step 1, selection. What materials can you use that you have in front of you without changing them at all? You do not have to change every activity. It is fine to just do some things from the book, from the materials. There is no shame in that at all. The next step, deletion. It might be complete deletion. So it might be that I mentioned a double page spread per lesson. It might be that I decide that there's a double page spread that actually I don't need at all. And if I get rid of that, then I can stretch something else across 2 lessons. I might look at a double page spread and decide that there's just this activity, I'm just going to get rid of. If I do that, though, I have to be aware of how the coursebook spread fits together. If I take out this activity, what knock-on effects might it have on other things in the lesson? Is that actually the preparation stage for the freer practice? If I take out this activity, does that mean that they're not going to be able to perform very well in the freer practice, for example, because they haven't thought of ideas and they're just going to say one sentence and that's the end? So when you delete activities, make sure that it's not key for something else that comes later in your lesson. You could also have partial deletion. So this is where you have an activity that maybe has many stages and you decide to take out one or more of those stages. But again, thinking about what the knock-on effects of that are. If I take out this stage, how does that affect what the students are able to do later on in the lesson? So we've got selection, deletion. The next stage, once you've kind of maybe reduced what you've got in the materials, you've still got your lesson objective, you've still got your students in mind. Addition, what are you going to add to the materials that are in front of you? You don't have to, but it might be that you decide that you need to extend a particular activity. There's no planning stage at the moment, and so you need to add a planning stage in. There's no pronunciation practice, and so you need to add pronunciation practice in. It might also be exploiting an activity. So the activity in the book is, for example, complete the sentences with the missing verbs, with the correct form of the verbs in the gaps. And so you think about how many other ways can you exploit that one activity. Not just doing it in that one way, but could they have pronunciation practice from it? Could they do some memorization from it? Could they do some translation work from it? So how can they reuse the same activity? I'll give you more ideas connected to this later on. It may be that you know that there's something that they need to help them to achieve your lesson objective, but that it's just not on the page at all. So you can't adapt or exploit an activity. You might have to get completely new materials from somewhere else. I think as new teachers or unconfident teachers, we very often go, okay, I need these materials and this activity, and I need this, and I need this, and I need this, and I need this. And we go into the lesson with enough materials for 4 lessons. And the students are dotting around from one thing to another, to another, to another, to another, and there's no flow in the lesson. So when you are supplementing, when you are introducing new materials, be careful. Do you need to? Do you really need to? It's more work for you, and sometimes it can confuse the students because they're moving from one context to another. So I would tend to say, if you can, adapt, extend, exploit rather than supplementing. But if you really need to, then obviously do supplement materials, find them from elsewhere. Okay, and then the 4th evaluative process, changing things. So here, this would be when it says modifications to procedure. That might be, for example, that you completely change the order of activities on the page. You're still doing the activities that you've got, but you're, for example, instead of having a freer practice at the end of the lesson, you might use that at the beginning of the lesson to see what the learners know. You might, where it says replacements, like changes to context or content, you may have a controlled practice that's based on one particular context, but that isn't appropriate for your students culturally, for example. So you may decide to tweak some of the sentences. You don't need to change the activity completely. You don't need a new activity or an extended activity, but you might just need to change some of the words within the questions, for example, so that it's more appropriate for your learning. I have been talking non-stop for a little while, so let's see. Have you? Thank you for putting the name of the book into the chat. Has anybody got any questions or observations at this point that you want to add? You're all keeping up okay. And by the way, I'll share the references at the end. I'll share those books at the end. This was the other one that we were talking about. Okay, thanks, Dahlia. Okay, so thinking about sharing, there we are. So I've come back to Cunningsworth, who was the first person that I spoke about, and he took what to adapt and divided it into 6 different categories. And I've used this as a framework. So I've got a single slide for you now that has all of these examples. And then I'm going to show you a particular set of materials, and I'm going to talk to you about how I might adapt those materials for an online or a face-to-face lesson. I'm just going to throw lots and lots of ideas at you, just to show you how many different ways you might be able to use a single set of materials. Sadly, there are no correct answers to this, but just to give you ways to think about it. Okay, so Cunningsworth divides potential areas for materials adaptation into the following. So he starts off with methods. By the way, the title is Cunningsworth's, and the ideas underneath are some of his and some of mine. So methods in the classroom, you might think about movement. You might think about heads down work, where you're potentially looking at materials, looking at your notebook. Heads up work, where you're looking at the screen, looking at the board in a face-to-face classroom, talking to a partner. That's all heads up work. And I think John Hughes is the person who introduced that term. So heads up, heads down. How do you vary those things? Interaction patterns. So are the students working alone? Are they working in pairs? Are they working in groups? Are you working in whole class with the teacher in charge? Whole class with the students in charge? You can still vary interaction patterns in a one-to-one lesson as well, because the student can do some things alone. They can do some things where you're the partner. But you can also bring guests into your lesson sometimes as well. So the interaction might be between the student and a guest. It might be between the student and a video. So how is the interaction different during the lesson? Okay, another way that you might vary your methods are your feedback techniques. So do you, at the end of every activity, do you always say, okay, Dalia, what's the answer to question 1? Sophia, what's the answer to question 2? Daria, what's the answer to question 3? Okay, Dalia, what's the answer to question 1? Sophia, what's the answer to question 2? Daria, what's the answer to question 3? If you do your feedback in the same way after every activity, that's quite dull. But also the students switch off because they're just waiting for their turn. So thinking about ways to vary your feedback techniques, I'll show you some examples in a minute. That can be a way to vary your methods, to adapt your materials. And none of these things necessarily involve more preparation. You're just thinking about your lesson in a different way. Okay, so methods is the first area. Okay, the next area, language content. You might need to adapt this for your students. You might need to think about the amount of vocabulary, the amount of grammar rules that they're seeing at once. It may be that you need to extend it. You've got quite a strong group. They already know most of what's on the page. You may need to add some more, which could come from you or could come from them. You may need to reduce it. You might need to divide it over a couple of lessons. You might need to say, okay, we're going to study these 10 in class. The other 10 are optional for you to study at home. So you might need to change the amount in some way. It may also be that some of the students in the group can cope with all of the words, but some students need to just focus on core words. So you may decide to identify, you've got 10 words, you might decide to identify these are the 6 core words that by the end of the lesson everybody needs to know, and these are the 4 kind of extension words that if you know them, great, and if you don't, no problem. Language content, you might need to think about the meaning, the use of the language that's in there. So who is using it? Where are they using it? And actually, is this the most appropriate way of using it? Is this actually the most common way that this is used in life? I know that can be difficult to work out, but you might find that using something like EnglishCorpora.org can help you to work out how some language is actually used. If you look at it and think, that doesn't feel right to me. And you don't have to be a native speaker to have language instincts. You might also decide for meaning and use, you might also decide that actually your students are, for example, I taught in Paraguay for a while, and I had a page in the back of the book that was about going to the airport. And my Paraguayan students, most of them had never left the country, much less got on the plane. And if they were going to go anywhere, they would probably go on a bus because that was affordable. So I decided that the phrases that they had for the airport, that I was going to adjust them so that it was for catching a bus. So I chose and then I changed some of the phrases so that they were more appropriate to being on a bus. So I changed the meaning or the use of the phrases. You might need to think about the form. Is there actually a focus on form? If you're teaching vocabulary, is there a focus on the spellings? Is there a focus on the prepositions? If you're teaching grammar, is it actually clear what the structure is? Or do you think your students already know it from before? And so filling in that table of all of the verb structures is actually a waste of time for your students. So you might decide to do more form work, you might decide to do less form work based on what your students need. Pronunciation. Pronunciation for many teachers is a big, scary thing, and they just avoid it. I think definitely when I was a new teacher, I would never teach pronunciation. But actually, if you only focus on the form, that's the written part of the language. If your students aren't working on pronunciation, they're not improving their listening and they're not improving their confidence when they speak. And pronunciation work is often also an opportunity to memorize language as well. So making sure that you don't skip the pronunciation work all the time, that you include some pronunciation work. If you search on my blog for pronunciation, there are various activities on there that you can use. But adapting your materials to add more pronunciation work or to make it specific to where you are. So, for example, I can see there are various Thai people here at the moment. So you might want to work more on consonant clusters. If your students are Arabic speaking, you might want to do more of a focus on b, p differences, for example, or I, differences. So thinking about what pronunciation can you work on with the language that you have in the lesson. Okay, another area that you can adapt. The subject matter. I think we've all had that situation where you've turned a page in your materials or you've opened up some materials and your heart has just dropped because you're like, oh, really? Do I really have to do this with my students? So if you have no choice, if you have to do those materials, finding a different way into the materials. How can you look at it creatively? How can you think about it creatively? So, for example, I once saw a blog post from Dave Dodgson, I think, and he was talking about the At the Doctor's lesson with his students, and he was teaching 9 and 10-year-old primary school students. Why would they need to be able to go to the doctors in English? They don't need that language. It's not immediately relevant to them. So to get them interested in the lesson, he showed them the picture of everybody in the doctor's surgery. So you can see, somebody with a broken arm, you can see somebody who, is holding the head or is holding their mouth or whatever. And he asked the students first to predict or to tell the story, like how did they end up in the doctor's surgery? So there was like an alien child who had been left on Earth by their parents. There was, what else was there? There was somebody who wasn't paying attention and who had walked into a wall. So they found a different way of getting into the lesson. And then when they were listening to the stories, to the dialogues of, I've got a headache or whatever it was, then they had to get that into their story. So they had to get those phrases into their story of, oh no, I walked into a wall and now I've got a headache. And that's a very poor description of what happened in the lesson, but it gives you an idea of a different way that you can approach the same materials and get the students interested in it. Another thing with subject matter might be the authenticity of it. I think we've often listened to things in course books and you're like, these are two wooden people talking to each other. There is nothing interesting happening. There is nothing, there's no tension in this situation. So getting students to extend dialogues, to edit dialogues, to make them more dramatic. What are the extra problems in this situation? John Hughes recommends a rule of 3. So rather than going to the train station or going to the hotel and saying, I want to check into room 401, and the receptionist says, okay, here's your key, you have to have 2 problems before you have the solution. So I want to check into room 401. I'm very sorry, the person hasn't checked out yet. Okay, but when can I check in? You can't check in until 3 p.m. Okay, but I'm here now and it's 1 p.m. What are you going to do? Well, I can give you this other room into 405, whatever. So adding in those little ways of making it feel more authentic. It's very rare that you go and ask for something and get it immediately without any problems, for example. And the subject matter as well, I already talked about the doctors. How do you make it relevant to your students? Okay. So thanks, Danielle. Okay. Another way that you might think about adaptation. So what is the balance of skills within your lesson? What's the balance of receptive skills versus productive skills? Is there a lot of listening and reading and very little speaking or writing? Or is it all speaking and there's no input for them? There's no problem with those things. You just need to think about what are the needs of your students? What do they actually need to be able to do to improve their lesson? Sorry, improve their English. You might think of the balance of their skills in terms of written versus spoken production, because I think very, very often we try and do a lot of speaking. Students never practice writing ever, and then they get to high levels and they go, I hate writing, it's really hard. But speaking was really hard once as well, but they've done lots of practice of it, so now it's not hard. So finding opportunities for them to do little bits of writing all the time, right from the beginning. And I think that's where teaching online can be fantastic, because the chat box is there. I taught beginners last year, and I think they did pretty equal amounts of speaking and writing. And because it was exciting to write in the chat box, they didn't complain about having to write. It was normal. It was a normal part of the lessons. So thinking about how to make sure the students are getting written practice as well as spoken practice. Another question here is, are you training their skills or are you testing their skills? So a lot of the reading and listening that we have in course books is testing them. It's, can you comprehend this? Can you answer these questions? So thinking about how you can include little bits of training. So you had a problem with that question. Let's listen to that excerpt again. Just that one sentence, that 2 sentences. Okay, what did you hear? Okay, you heard this, but what they actually said is this. Okay, now listen again. Can you hear this? So those little bits of training can really help. The same with speaking and writing. How are you actually training them to improve their speaking and writing skills? Not just practicing it, but actually feeding in extra language, feeding in extra skills to be able to, or sub-skills, to be able to become better speakers, better writers. These are all very big areas, but I suggest that you choose one thing that you're interested in and then go and find out more about it. A lot of these things I've written about on my blog previously as well. Or if there's anything where if you go to my blog post and see this and you'd like more information but you can't find it, just leave a comment under the blog post and I'll see if I can share some resources for you. Another area you might think about when adapting your materials is the progression, the grading. So what order are the things on the page? I talked about that before. Or have the students already learnt some part of this? And therefore, can I skip something? Can I move things around? What kind of scaffolding are you providing? What kind of support are you providing to the students to be able to produce or understand to the best of their ability? For example, planning stages. And this comes into memorization time or prep time. You've taught them some phrases, you want them to use it in their speaking, but have you actually given them a minute or 2 to actually memorize those phrases, to remember those phrases before they then speak? Or time to choose 2 or 3 questions to focus on rather than answering all 10 questions in the box, for example. Okay, last one. Another area you might need to think about with your adaptations is design. You might want to think about the images on the page. Are there any images? What images can you use in different ways? I'll give you some examples in a minute. You might need to think about the layout of the page. So quite often there might be a lot of information on the page, or if you're creating slides, how are you laying them out? How much information are you giving people? You'll see that my slide that I have right now has a lot of information on it, but I've given it to you gradually. I haven't given it all at the same time, and hopefully it's laid out in a way that's very clear that you can find the key information later. And I've also thought about this layout so that you can take a screenshot if you want to, and you can come back to it later. So this is kind of your notes from the session. Design, you may also need to think about readability, so font sizes. If you're teaching online, think about how big it is if people are doing it on a little mobile phone. You might have a massive computer screen and it all looks great, but if they're on a little mobile phone, will they still be able to read it? Especially if they've got something else open at the same time. Readability can also be an issue for people with special educational needs. For example, if there's a dark background, a dark background with light text, for some people that can be easier to read than a light background with dark text. Readability can also be, for example, maybe trying to avoid having a picture with text on top of it, because that can be very distracting, very difficult to read. So those are all potential design issues, readability issues. Cultural content as well. You might need to think about whether the cultural content is relevant to your students or is even permissible in the societies that you're working in. So those are all areas to think about. Okay, Abia, how long have I got? I think I've got too much information.
It's okay. I mean, we're here, they're here. So if,
if you need to run away, don't worry, it will all be available.
And it's live on social media, so it will be there. The recording will be there. So excellent. Yeah, perfect.
Okay, so I've shown you these areas from Cunningsworth then. So what I'm going to do now is show you. So you could think about your lesson that I mentioned before. How might you change these things with your specific lesson? I'm going to show you these materials from English File that I think some of you might be familiar with. This is a very typical course book spread. You've got some grammar work, you've got some pronunciation work, you've actually got reading and listening and speaking and writing, which is quite unusual, although I'm not going to talk about the writing because really that's linking you to a different page. And you've got some vocabulary work on modifiers. So there's a little bit of everything going on this page. When I taught from this book, I had 90 minutes to deal with this lesson. And I had to make lots of decisions about what to keep, what to take away. I'm going to take each of the Cunningsworth areas that I just showed you and give you some ideas for how I might tweak the page or tweak the materials to adapt in each of those areas. There's not a complete lesson at the end of it. It's just when I look at the page, these are things that I might think about. And it's both for face-to-face and for online. Somebody mentioned earlier on about what is suitable online. And actually, I think about 80% of what we do in the face-to-face classroom, we can do online with 0 tweaks. And about another 10% we can do with quite minimal tweaks. I think there are very few things that you can only do in one or the other situation. So let's see how this works. So let's start off with methods then. So if you look at the left-hand side, you can see the 4 different kind of key things that I mentioned before. There will be some crossover. My ideas won't necessarily fit tidily into one particular area. So movement, how could I adapt it? So I could face-to-face, I could get the students to stand up and walk around or work with a different partner for the discussion tasks in 3A, the reading and listening, or in 1D, creating your own sentences, or in 5B, talk to a partner. So I could get them to move around. In both face-to-face and online, I could ask the students, I would not do this myself, ask the students to make 6 small pieces of paper, rip up or cut up a piece of paper, and write out the 6 words, and then get them to organize them themselves. That puts a little bit of movement into the lesson. You can also do a running dictation online. So the students stand away from their computer. I won't demonstrate it now because this wall is right behind me. I dictate a sentence from 1A, for example, one of these signed sentences, and the students run from the other side of the room and put the correct letter in the chat. So there's ideas for movement there. There might also be as many of the activities as you can. In exercise 1 grammar, choose the order they're going to be in. The answers are available here. Ask me if you have any questions. So I might hand over the control to the students. I might offer choices to the students with the interaction. I might want to say, do you want to do the reading or the listening? So here, if they did the reading, I would then give them a very brief verbal summary of what's in the listening, or vice versa. If they want to do the listening, I will give them a brief verbal summary of what's in the reading, so they don't have to read the whole text. In 1D, they're writing sentences about the school where they're currently learning English. That's the task in the book. But I might ask them to write those sentences about anywhere else that they choose. 5B questions, I might get them to add their own ideas, add their own extra ideas to that, or 4B as well. And once they've come up with their own ideas, then they can share their ideas with other people in the class. So changing the interaction with it. Oops, sorry. Feedback techniques. For 1A, I might get everybody to just write the answers in the chat. So to get them to write 1A, 2B, 3C, 4D, for example. For 4A and 4B, when I'm online, I would get them to annotate the screen. My teenagers, my beginners last year, every lesson, as soon as I shared a screen, they were like, teacher, annotate. They learned that word very quickly. For 4B, let's compare with a partner. Comparing, and then you do a quick feedback afterwards. So 4B, when you set up the activity, you say compare with the partner, how similar or different are you? And then your feedback question afterwards isn't what did you write for 1, what did you write for 2? The question is, okay, if you are, how similar or different to your partner are you? Write 1 to 5 in the box for it might be listen to your partner, choose one language learning experience they had that you can now share with the rest of the group. Another feedback technique might be to give one student all of the answers, and you switch off your camera or you move to the back of the physical classroom, and that student becomes the teacher. They check all of the answers. I do occasionally have to stand immediately outside the classroom door because otherwise they will turn around and look at me after every question. For feedback as well, I think it's always important if they've worked individually to get them to work in pairs before you check the answers in a whole class, and then more of the students will be likely to contribute then. Okay, so that's ways that you can adapt the methods. Okay, ways of adapting the language content. The amount, I've got modal verbs and I've got modifiers. That could be too much, especially in an online class where things take longer. I might choose to ask the students to look at one of those for homework and then do the other one in class and just do practice with them. I might decide that one of them is not so relevant for my students, that they don't need one or the other of them. Meaning and use, I might need to give them the rules rather than elicit the rules. I might get them to try an activity, so to try 1D or 4B before they actually look at the rules. So I might change the order of things with the meaning and the use. With the form, I might highlight the form of the modal verbs on the screen or on the board. I might ask the students to remember the modifiers and write the spellings, or to remember the sentences from 1A and write them out without looking, and that focuses on the form. As you hopefully can see, a lot of these ideas are minimal or zero prep. They're just slightly different ways of using what's on the page. Pronunciation work. I might say to the students, okay, you have 1 minute to remember the sentences from 1A. Okay, now cover them up. And now I point to a sign and I say, for example, B, and the students have to remember and say the sentence. They can do that in pairs as well. I might give them the first letters to help them to remember the sentences. With the modifiers, I might point to areas on the Klein for them to remember the words. I might also have sentences for 2A. I might have minimal pairs sentences. So you must use a dictionary, you mustn't use a dictionary. 1 is all you must, and 2 is all you mustn't. And I say 1, and the students have to say, is it number 1 or number 2? And then they hand over to their partner, or they work with partners, sorry. And one of them says one of these sentences, and the other student says, is it number 1 or is it number 2? Okay, so that's ways of increasing the pronunciation work or changing the palm work. Okay, subject matter. So because this is about learning a language, I think for quite a lot of students, it's probably fairly motivating. Obviously, there's 1 or 2 that won't care. But I might start at a different point on the page. I think launching straight in with the signs might not be the most interesting way to start the lesson. So I might start with 3A, for example, to get them involved. And probably if I'm teaching online, I would put that question into the chat, or I would put them into breakout rooms and broadcast it as a message. I don't think that I would do that from the book because they would be distracted by everything else on the page. Another way to get them interested in the topic is I might tell them the situation that we're going to find out about Max, who's a British journalist, and he was learning Spanish. This is the headline of the article I wrote. I will survive in Spanish, or will I? And then ask them to predict the content before they read. So that might be another way to get them interested. Or another way into the lesson might be to get them to do the 5B questions right at the beginning of the lesson. So they can predict, so they can have a discussion to get them speaking right from the beginning. I think the authenticity and the relevance, I don't think you necessarily need to modify this page. I don't think those are problematic here. Okay, the balance of skills. Receptive work, productive work, they're fairly well balanced on the page, unless you decide to take an activity out. So if you decide, for example, to remove all of the reading and listening, you might want to think about how you're going to get a little bit of input into your lesson. Because otherwise, at that point, there's a tiny bit of writing in 1D when they're writing sentences. I'm ignoring exercise 6 because that's a separate lesson, really. I might replace 5B, rather than them speaking to their partners, I might replace that with creating an article or a blog post with their own. If I get the students to use the chat, and how much I get them to actually say things in class. And when I do get them to say things in open class, is it the same 2 or 3 students that always participate, or is there a range of students who are contributing to open class discussions? Training page at the moment is testing their skills. It's not actually training them to be better speakers, readers, writers at the moment. So I might focus on individual sentences from the listening, maybe some with connected speech. I might, after the reading, I might ask the students to think about how they knew what the answers were and to share that with their partners. They could do that in their first language as well. I might ask them to underline where grammar or vocabulary focus to give me more time to spend on either the reading or the listening. Or I might decide to skip listening to do reading because that's what my students need, for example. Okay, progression and grading. So at the moment, this page is present, practice, produce. Present the grammar in 1A and the rules in 1B. And then practice it with 1C, and then produce it in 1D and 1E. Or present the vocabulary within the text, and think about the rules in 4A, practice it in 4B, and produce it in 5, along with the grammar from earlier on. So I might decide to make it more task-based. So if I start from 5B, for example, at the beginning of the lesson, then I can choose which parts of the page I will move on to based on what my students need. I also might decide to reduce the amount of language work and focus on skills, or increase the amount of language work and reduce the skills work, depending on what my students need. Scaffolding, at the moment, there isn't a lot of support for the students on this page. So 3B, 3D, for example, I might do the first one together with my students so they know exactly how to do that activity. Even if you think, oh, true or false is quite simple, they should be okay with it. Doing the first question together with the students can help them to feel more confident. Like, yes, I got that answer right, I can get the other 6 right as well. With 2B, when they are listening and writing the sentences, I might tell them how many words are in each sentence, for example. So in sentence 1, there are 8 words. Okay, have you got 8 words? Let's listen again. Let's listen again. Okay, now you've got 8 words. Okay, check with your partner. I might, with that listening and writing as well, I probably wouldn't play all of them one after the other. I would probably play number 1, number 1, number 1, number 1 until they're ready with it. Number 2, number 2, number 2, number 2. I probably wouldn't play 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So thinking about the order that you play that kind of listening track in. I would probably add preparation time and memorization time into 5A and 5B as well. Memorization of the modifiers, potentially with look cover, write, check. You've got the same thing. The same with the memorization of the form of the modal verbs. So look, cover, write, check. You can also get the students to memorize some interesting language from the reading or the listening as well. There's a lot of language input that's available to them there through the questions and through the texts themselves. I could get them to choose one of the have you ever questions to remember for a future lesson as well, for example. Yeah, giving them thinking time before they write their sentences in 1D as well. Sorry, I know I've gone very over. We're nearly at the end. Okay, design. What might I change here? Oops. Oh no, sorry, I didn't update my slide here. That should say design at the side. We'll just ignore that. So the images, I might pull some of the images off the page. I might exploit them more. So for example, look at the picture. What's the conversation between the two men? How might it change if it was between two women? Would they have the same kind of conversation, a different conversation? I might use the image for prediction along with the headline. With the modifiers, I might get the students to put a little symbol next to each modifier to help them remember the amount. With the layout of the page, it's very busy. There's a lot of things going on. So if I'm online, I can mask or cover parts of the page if I don't want to use screenshots. But if the students are using it in a book, I could also get them to use their notebook to cover the other page, for example, or to cover the other column so they can just focus on the bit that they need to deal with. If I'm online, I can also use circles or arrows for their attention to particular parts of the page. If somebody has dyslexia or other reading problems, masking the page so that they can only see 3 or 4 lines at once can really help them to read more successfully as well, because there's not as much information coming into their brain. They're just dealing with a limited amount of changing information. Readability, the text is very tightly spaced, very closely spaced. That could be quite challenging for some students. You may need to retype it. Actually, if it's English file, all of the reading texts are available as Word documents from the Oxford online Teachers Club. So they're already typed up for you, so you can space them out, you can change the layout there. The colours are probably quite good though, because you have dark text on a pale yellow background. That can be quite good to read. Cultural content, he's going to a bar. I imagine in some places that going to a bar where it says beer in Spanish on the front of it is probably not appropriate. It should be fairly easy to change that to a cafe and to change the picture to go with that. So you might need to think about that cultural content. So I'm giving you lots of different ideas. And let's give you a little summary, a little range of ways that you could think about your lessons. There are many different things that you could have as dichotomies here, but you might think about your lesson. Is there more moving around, sitting down? Do you want to balance them a bit more? Is there more teaching or testing? Do you want to balance them a bit more? There's no problem with it being one or the other, but just how much of a balance is there? Is there more heads up or heads down work? Is there more work where the teacher's in control? You'd have many different things within these dichotomies. Okay. I'm just very quickly, I will answer some questions in just a moment. I'm just going to very quickly mention that I have written some books. So if you're interested in buying them, I will put the link into the chat in a moment for you. The richer speaking one is ways of adapting speaking activities. So that's exactly what we've been talking about today. The other 2 books are reflective tasks to help you become better teachers. So that is the presentation, and you can think about, did you get what you wanted? I'm going to stop sharing and see what questions people had. So let me just find the chat. Let's see. Yeah, sorry to those people who have to leave in a minute, because I know I've gone very over. Yeah, how far can you go with materials adaptation? So, Sophia, the answer to that question is, how far do you need to go? Because I think sometimes we can get very over enthusiastic about adapting materials, and we feel like we need to change everything. So I think the question with materials adaptation is, do you actually need to do it? And will it help your students? So that question is yes, go for it. Do as much adaptation as you need to do. But don't stay and don't work orders that you have. Make sure you look after your mental health as well. Change what needs to be changed and nothing else. There's a just about your compensation. All of these slides will be available on here in approximately 10 minutes. I think it's a very, very big question. I think all of the adaptations that I've mentioned, they are considerations to think about with any kind of class. One thing I would say with EAP is, don't be afraid of getting them to move. I think a lot of EAP lessons are very static, and I think we all appreciate being able to move, especially when you've been sat here for an hour listening to me. So yeah. Anybody else got any questions?
Thank you very much, Sandy. I think it was a very beneficial, there were a lot of beneficial tips given to teachers, and it's going to reconsider how they not only adapt material, but also plan their lessons for online sessions, because there have been some misconceptions about planning and delivering online sessions. And I think now things are starting to get clearer, especially with the back planning. I think it might have been a new terminology for a lot of people who have attended. It's for me also a new one. So thank you very much. It has been very interesting presentation, and I think everyone who has been here participated really effectively. We've got a lot of people attending on social media. It is already recorded on Facebook, International House Cairo, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. So for those who have missed it, please don't hesitate to go and listen to the recording at later time, so you can take notes. You've got Sandy's blog, which is an excellent source of practical tips. So you can always communicate with her through her blog. Sandy will also have a short article summing up what she has talked about, not only on her blog, but also on International House website once she's done with her blog. So thank you very much, Sandy. It was great having you with us today. Let me introduce the next webinar, if you don't mind, really quick. So we do have a webinar coming up next week. It's going to be a Sunday. So if you are in professional development, but you're a busy teacher and you're into professional development, please join us next week. Here is the link to registering for the webinar. Fiona is going to be giving a presentation on professional development. Okay, so please join us. And yes, Sandy has a lot of posts on her Delta, so this is something that she is currently if you're following up her blog. Thank you very much, Sandy, and thank you, attendees. You will be sent your certificates towards the end of the week. We will look forward to having Sandy again with us at some point, maybe talking about a different topic. Thank you and good luck. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. You're very, you're always there. So thank you very much. I hope